The dust settled around the wagon as Martha Hayes clutched the wooden side rail and tried to steady her breathing and her heart, which hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. And she could feel every eye in Bennett Springs boring into her back as the wagon creaked to a stop in front of the general store. And she knew what they were all thinking, because she had heard the whispers for weeks now, ever since Jacob Thornton had made his accusations in the saloon and told anyone who would listen that she had stolen from him and broken their engagement, because she was nothing but a conniving woman looking for better prospects. She had nowhere left to turn and no family to take her in, and the boarding house had asked her to leave 3 days ago when the owner said her presence was making the other guests uncomfortable. And Martha had spent the last 2 nights sleeping in the back of this borrowed wagon, surrounded by what little she owned in the world. And she was so tired and so hungry and so utterly alone that when she saw the tall figure of Thomas Brennan walking toward her from across the street, she felt something inside her break like a dam that had been holding back too much water for far too long. Thomas was the rancher who lived 5 miles outside of town, and he kept to himself mostly and came into Bennett Springs only when he needed supplies. And he had a quiet way about him that some people mistook for coldness, but Martha had always noticed how he treated the store clerks with respect and how he always held the door for anyone coming behind him, and how his eyes were kind even though his face rarely smiled. And now those same eyes were looking at her with something she had not seen in so long that she almost did not recognize it, and that something was concern without judgment. He stopped beside the wagon and removed his hat, and his voice was low and steady when he spoke, and he said that he had heard she was having some difficulties, and Martha felt the tears she had been holding back begin to slip down her cheeks, and she could not stop them, no matter how hard she tried, and she heard herself say words that she never thought she would say to anyone, and certainly not to a man she barely knew. But desperation has a way of stripping away pride until only raw need remains. Hold me and use me and just get me out of here. And she trembled as she said it, and her voice broke on the last word, and she waited for him to look away, or worse, to take advantage of what she was offering in her desperation. But Thomas Brennan did neither of those things, and instead he reached up and took her hand in his, and his palm was rough from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. And he said something that made her cry even harder because it was so unexpected and so impossibly kind. You do not need to offer me anything, and you do not need to be anything other than someone who needs help right now. And I have plenty of room at my ranch, and I could use someone to help with the cooking and the housekeeping if you are willing to work, and you can stay as long as you need to, and no one will bother you there. And when she looked into his eyes, she saw that he meant every word, and there was no hidden price and no expectation of anything beyond what he had stated plainly. The ride out to the Brennan ranch took nearly an hour, and Martha sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence was not uncomfortable, and she watched the landscape change from the clustered buildings of town to the open prairie with its rolling hills and endless sky, and she felt something loosen in her chest. With each mile they traveled away from the judgment and the whispers and the shame that had been crushing her for so long. The ranch house was simple but well maintained, with a wide porch and windows that caught the afternoon light, and there was a barn and a corral, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance. And Thomas helped her down from the wagon and carried her few belongings inside, and showed her to a small room at the back of the house that had a bed and a dresser and a window that looked out over a meadow where wildflowers grew in purple and yellow clusters. He left her alone to settle in, and when she emerged an hour later after washing her face and changing into her one clean dress, she found him in the kitchen trying to make coffee and making a mess of it, and despite everything she felt the corner of her mouth lift in something that was almost a smile. And she said that she would take over the coffee and the cooking if he would show her where everything was kept, and he nodded and stepped aside with obvious relief. The days that followed developed a rhythm that was both strange and comforting, and Martha woke each morning before dawn and made breakfast and coffee, and Thomas ate without much conversation, but always thanked her, and then he would head out to work the ranch, and she would clean and organize the house, which had clearly been neglected by a man living alone, and she would prepare dinner, and he would return as the sun was setting, dusty and tired, and they would eat together and sometimes talk about small things like the weather or the cattle or what needed fixing around the property. She waited for him to ask about what had happened in town and about Jacob Thornton and the accusations and why she had been so desperate that day on the wagon, but Thomas never asked, and Martha began to understand that he was giving her the gift of not having to explain herself and not having to defend her choices and not having to relive the humiliation unless she chose to share it, and that freedom was more valuable than gold. 3 weeks passed and then 4, and Martha felt herself beginning to breathe more easily, and the knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion started to loosen, and she found herself humming while she worked and noticing small beauties like the way the morning light came through the kitchen window and the sound of birdsong at dawn and the simple satisfaction of bread rising in the warm oven one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Thomas spoke more than he usually did, and he told her about his late wife Sarah, who had died 5 years ago from fever, and how he had loved her more than he thought it was possible to love another person, and how her death had left a hole in his life that he thought would never heal. And his voice was quiet, but steady as he talked, and Martha listened without interrupting. And when he finished, she reached over and placed her hand on his, and they sat like that until the stars came out. She found the courage to tell her own story a few days later, and they were working together in the garden pulling weeds, and she told him about Jacob Thornton and how he had courted her with pretty words and promises, and how she had believed him when he said he loved her, and how she had trusted him with her savings to invest in his business venture, and how after he had her money, he had started finding fault with everything she did, and how when she finally confronted him about returning her money, he had turned the whole thing around and accused her of stealing from him. Instead, Thomas listened without judgment, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that he had known Jacob Thornton for years, and the man had a reputation for being charming and dishonest, and that Martha was not the first person he had taken advantage of, and probably would not be the last, and hearing someone believe her and validate her experience was like medicine for a wound she had thought would never heal. The summer turned to autumn, and the air grew crisp, and the leaves on the cottonwood trees turned gold, and Martha realized that she was happy, and that happiness had crept up on her so gradually she had not noticed it happening until it was fully present, and she loved the work of keeping the house and cooking meals that Thomas appreciated, and she loved the quiet evenings on the porch and the easy companionship that had developed between them, and she loved feeling safe and valued and respected. Thomas had started smiling more, and sometimes she would catch him watching her as she worked, and there was something in his expression that made her heart flutter in a way that was both terrifying and wonderful, and she knew that she was falling in love with this quiet rancher who had shown her kindness when she had nothing to offer in return, and she did not know if he felt the same way, and she was afraid to risk the peace she had found by speaking her feelings aloud. Winter came with its first snow in late November, and the ranch took on a hushed quality with everything blanketed in white, and Thomas brought in extra firewood and made sure the house was warm, and they spent the long evenings sitting by the fire and reading aloud to each other from books he had collected over the years, and sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence and listen to the wind outside and the crackling of the logs burning. On Christmas Eve, Thomas gave her a gift wrapped in brown paper, and when she opened it, she found a beautiful shawl in deep blue wool, and she knew it must have cost him dearly, and she had nothing to give him in return except the words she had been holding in her heart for months, and so she said them simply and honestly, and told him that he had saved her life, and not just from the wagon that day in town, but from the belief that she was worthless and unlovable, and that she loved him and wanted to stay forever if he would have her. Thomas looked at her with those kind eyes that had first given her hope, and he reached for her hand, and he said that he had fallen in love with her somewhere between the terrible coffee that first morning and the way she hummed while hanging laundry, and that he had been afraid to speak because he did not want her to feel obligated or pressure.